May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In the opening line of our story this morning from the beginning of the book of Exodus, we hear that note of ominous foreshadowing with the words, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Over the summer, we have been following the arc of the stories of the Hebrew patriarchs and matriarchs. And last Sunday, we heard the story immediately preceding this one in Genesis chapter 50, in which Joseph and his brothers are fully reconciled with each other, leaving them and their families to reside comfortably in Egypt. And generations of Jacob's descendants, as immigrants, have made their home in Egypt and contributed to its welfare. But this king did not know Joseph. He did not remember, or he chose to ignore. He chose to ignore, perhaps, Joseph's role in keeping the Egyptians alive during a time of famine. A tempting political strategy for any new leaders can involve trying to solidify their power by calling out a relatively weak minority group and labeling them as enemy. Fear of those people can be a powerful unifying force. And here, Pharaoh points to the rapidly growing Hebrew minority as an emerging threat, endangering Egypt's security and way of life. There is nothing in the biblical narrative that points to the Israelites as being anything but good, faithful citizens of Egypt. Yet this Pharaoh is fearful and warns the Egyptians that in the event of war, the Israelites might join our enemies and fight against us. And he responds by trying 3 different strategies to stem the growth of the Israelite people. Pharaoh's first strategy, to enslave the Israelites, does not work. So his second strategy is to demand that the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, kill all Hebrew male babies as they are born, but not the female babies. Ironically, Pharaoh sees no threat from Israelite females, yet it is females, the midwives, who are the very ones whose actions set the undoing of Pharaoh. The midwives' charge from God is to preserve and protect life. And the refusal to obey Pharaoh's command to kill is the Bible's first recorded act of civil disobedience and non-violent resistance for the sake of justice. The midwives respond by playing to Pharaoh's own stereotypes about immigrants and their breeding habits. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them, they respond when asked why they have left the Hebrew boys to live. But the resistance doesn't end with the midwives. Women continue to resist in this story. Moses' own mother figures out a way to save her baby from being killed by first hiding the child and then putting him into a basket in the river. Moses' sister Miriam follows the basket, this little ark, which holds the baby as it floats down the Nile River. And the text tells us that Moses' sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And I imagine her job is to make sure that the right person finds him. For when Moses' mother puts the child on the Nile, she has to know that the Pharaoh's palace is just downriver. And her risky strategy works. His little ark floats right into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, who rescues him, even though she immediately recognizes him as a Hebrew child. And Miriam just happens to be nearby and knows exactly where to find a woman who can nurse the baby's own mother. And Pharaoh's daughter actually pays Moses' mother to nurse this baby. The midwives' choices and actions impacted more than just Moses, since all the boys born during that time may have been saved because of these women's choices. It is reasonable to imagine that many who would later flee Egypt with Moses were able to do so because of midwives like Shiphrah and Puah, and their descendants will settle in the promised land. How far-reaching the acts of these midwives and the other faithful women proved to be, and how critically important it is for us to act likewise for the sake of justice. For even a few who might be seen by those in power as lowly and insignificant can change the course of history. Tomorrow marks the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, at which the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And it also marks the 60th anniversary of when 11-month-old Sharon Langley became the first African-American child to ride the carousel at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park in Baltimore on the day the park was integrated. That day represented the end of an 8-year effort of quiet yearly protests to desegregate the park. For many, it was a great day. As journalist Retta Blaney wrote, "I was there that day too. Like Sharon, I was taken by a parent, but my experience was quite different. Sharon's first day at the park turned out to be my last. I was 8, and my mother took me not for the rides, but for the excitement. I watched as a long line of mostly Black people marched through the doors, never to be kept out again. As we walked back to the car later, my mother said, 'Well, you'll never go there again.' And she was right. I was never taken again, nor was any child I knew. A large part of white Baltimore abandoned the park. Sharing the park was unthinkable to a great many people in 1963 Baltimore. And Sharon Langley shared that she was too young to remember that August day, but it has always been a part of her life story, recounted by her parents and captured in the Baltimore Sun photo showing a little girl in a white dress with a lace collar and a tiny cardigan looking at her father, who held her on the horse. That day had been recounted to her as triumphant, Blaney wrote. I didn't need anyone to recount it for me. The images were strongly burned into my memory. A street lined on either side, mostly by white people and policemen, a long wait, and then a procession of mostly Black people approaching, more Black people than I had ever seen. The tension was palpable. I felt small and afraid of what was going to happen. Fortunately, the integration was peaceful, but it wasn't until I was an adult that I understood the significance of that day. Langley's parents had been planning to go to the March on Washington, but they just couldn't find a babysitter. So instead, knowing that Gwynn Oaks was opening to everyone that same day, they took their only child to the park, demonstrating that one family can make a difference. In 2011, Langley co-authored a children's book about her experience and about segregation and social change, framed in terms of unkindness versus kindness, and with a message: we have an obligation to be part of change. The park closed in 1972 after being heavily damaged by Hurricane Agnes, and the Smithsonian Museum bought the carousel, and in 1981 moved it to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to welcome all children. A historical marker was placed on the gate surrounding it to commemorate its civil rights history. And one of the horses, called the Freedom Rider, is inscribed with the names of civil rights heroes, including the name of Sharon Langley. Even a few, even one, who might be seen by those in power as lowly and insignificant, can change the course of history. God calls each of us to change it for the better, to change it for the better for all God's children. Amen.